The gunshot that tore through the silent dawn of Redemption Creek, Wyoming territory, in 1875 was what first drew Harrison Zane away from the bottle and back to the land of the living. He hadn't intended to live past 30, but at 32, with a bullet-scarred shoulder and memories that haunted him more fiercely than any ghost, he found himself standing before a hastily assembled altar in the town's only church, marrying a woman whose face he'd barely glimpsed beneath her heavy veil. Her name was Eliza Vaughn, or so the marriage certificate stated. She had arrived on the afternoon stage just yesterday, clutching a letter that Harrison had written in a drunken stupor 3 months prior. A mail-order bride responding to an advertisement he had no recollection of placing. The townsfolk had whispered behind cupped hands as Harrison, bleary-eyed and still smelling of whiskey, had stumbled through the ceremony. Parson Williams had given him a disapproving frown, but the deed was done. Now, as Harrison led his new bride toward his modest ranch 5 miles outside of town, he studied her from the corner of his eye. She was slender, with auburn hair tucked beneath her bonnet, and eyes the color of summer sage. Pretty enough, he supposed, though her face bore the weariness of hard travel and perhaps harder living before that. "Your letter said the ranch was prosperous," she said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they'd left the church. Harrison adjusted his hat against the setting sun. "It was, when my father was alive. And now it's hanging on by a thread just like everything else in these parts." He didn't mention how he'd let the place fall into disrepair after returning from the war, how the bottle had become his closest companion. But there's good water, decent grazing land. Could be worse. Elizabeth nodded, her gaze fixed on the rutted trail ahead. "I've seen worse." As they crested the final hill, the Zane homestead came into view. It wasn't much a 2-room cabin, a barn that listed slightly to the north, a corral with 4 horses, and about 50 head of cattle grazing in the distance. What had once been his father's pride was now a testament to Harrison's failures. "Home, sweet home," he muttered, not bothering to hide the bitterness in his voice. Elizabeth said nothing as he helped her down from the wagon. Her traveling bag was light, suspiciously so for a woman starting a new life. Harrison wondered what she was running from, but then he wasn't one to pry into another's secrets. He had enough of his own. "I'll show you around," he said, leading her toward the cabin. "It ain't much, but the roof don't leak too bad." The inside of the cabin was sparse but clean. Harrison had made an effort this morning, sweeping the floors and changing the bedding. One room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall. The other held a bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin for washing. "You'll sleep in here," he said, gesturing to the bedroom. "I'll take the barn until we get to know each other better." The arrangement had seemed sensible when he'd thought of it earlier, though now, seeing her standing in his home, it felt oddly formal. Elizabeth set her bag on the bed and removed her bonnet. Her hair tumbled down in waves, catching the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the window. "That's very gentlemanly of you, Mr. Zane, Harrison," he corrected. "Figure if we're married, you ought to use my given name." "Harrison," she repeated, testing the feel of it on her tongue. "And I'm Elizabeth, though most call me Eliza." "Eliza," he echoed. It suited her better, somehow less formal, more human. "Are you hungry? I ain't much of a cook, but I can fry up some bacon and beans." She offered a tentative smile. "I can cook if you'd like." For the next hour, Harrison watched as Eliza transformed his bachelor kitchen into something resembling a home. She moved with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, and soon the cabin was filled with the smell of sizzling bacon and cornbread baking in the cast iron skillet. They ate at the rough-hewn table, another silence stretching between them, though this one felt less strained. "Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch," Harrison said as he pushed his empty plate away. "Not that there's much to see, but you should know what you've gotten yourself into." Eliza looked up from her food. "Why did you place the advertisement, Harrison, if you don't mind my asking?" The question caught him off guard. He reached for the coffee pot to buy himself time. "Reckon every man needs a wife eventually," he said finally. "And there ain't exactly a surplus of eligible women in Redemption Creek." "Is that all?" Harrison met her gaze, surprised by the directness in those sage green eyes. "No," he admitted. "Truth is, I was drunk. My friend Henry owns the saloon in town. He's been after me to settle down for years. Said I needed someone to pull me out of the bottle and back into the land of the living. Must have convinced me to write that letter when I was 3 sheets to the wind. And now that I'm here, do you regret it?" Harrison considered the question. Did he regret it? He barely knew this woman, yet here she was in his home wearing his ring. By rights, he should be terrified. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time: curiosity, maybe even a flicker of hope. "No," he said slowly, "I don't regret it. But I reckon we've both got some adjusting to do." Eliza nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "Well then, Mr. Zane Harrison, I think we'll manage just fine." Later, as Harrison made his way to the barn, he found himself wondering what twist of fate had brought Eliza Vaughn to his doorstep. She was clearly educated, with a refinement that seemed at odds with the rough frontier life. What had driven her to answer an advertisement from a stranger, to travel hundreds of miles to marry a man she'd never met? As he settled onto a makeshift bed of hay and blankets, Harrison realized it had been the first day in years he hadn't reached for a bottle. Whether that was a good omen or simply a coincidence remained to be seen. Dawn broke with the raucous crowing of Harrison's rooster. He woke with a start, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol that wasn't there. Old habits died hard. For a moment, he was disoriented, the barn's familiar smells and sounds a stark reminder that his life had changed irrevocably yesterday. He had a wife now, a stranger sleeping in his bed. Harrison dressed quickly, splashing cold water from the trough onto his face to chase away the last vestiges of sleep. As he approached the cabin, he caught the scent of coffee and something sweet baking. His stomach growled in response. Eliza was already up, her hair neatly braided and pinned at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, but somehow she made it look elegant. "Morning," Harrison said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Good morning," Eliza replied, sliding a pan of biscuits from the oven. "I hope you're hungry." They ate in companionable silence. The biscuits were light and fluffy, unlike the heavy brick-like creations Harrison usually managed. He found himself eating 3 before he realized it. "These are good," he said, feeling awkward at the simple praise. "Real good," Eliza smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Thank you. My mother taught me to cook when I was just a girl, said it was the surest way to a man's heart." "Smart woman," Harrison replied, then immediately felt foolish. Was he flirting with his own wife? The whole situation was surreal. After breakfast, Harrison showed Eliza around the ranch. The morning was crisp and clear, the sky a vast expanse of blue that seemed to stretch forever. The Tetons rose majestically in the distance, still capped with snow despite the late spring weather. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, her gaze taking in the sweeping vistas. "So open, so free." "That it is," Harrison agreed. "My father came out here when there was nothing but Indians and trappers. Built this place from the ground up." He pointed to a ridge in the distance. "That's our northern boundary. Creek marks the western edge, and to the east, we share grazing land with the neighboring ranch, not as much as it once was, but enough to get by. And the cattle. 53 head at last count. Used to be more, but we've had troubles with rustlers the past few years, and I haven't been as attentive as I should have been." The admission was difficult, but Harrison felt she deserved the truth. Eliza studied the distant herd. "My father raised cattle in Missouri before the war. I know a little about ranching." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "That's so, didn't figure you for a ranch girl." "There's a lot you don't know about me, Harrison Zane," she said, a hint of mystery in her voice. "Just as there's much I don't know about you." They continued their tour, Harrison pointing out the various outbuildings, the vegetative garden that had gone to seed, the small orchard his mother had planted years ago. Eliza listened attentively, asking questions that revealed a practical mind and a genuine interest. By midday, Harrison found himself relaxing in her presence. There was something soothing about Eliza, a steadiness that anchored him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his ghosts lighten slightly. "I need to ride into town this afternoon," he said, as they returned to the cabin for the midday meal. Need to pick up some supplies and check in with Henry. He usually has work for me, odd jobs, cattle drives, that sort of thing. Henry, Eliza asked. Is that your friend from the saloon? Harrison nodded. Henry Blackstone, known him since we were boys, fought together in the war too. He's about the only person in this county I trust completely. Would you mind if I came along? I'd like to see more of Redemption Creek. The request surprised him. It ain't much of a town, one street, a handful of businesses, the kind of place most folks are trying to leave, not explore. Nevertheless, I'd like to see it, if you don't mind the company. Harrison found he didn't mind at all. An hour later, they were heading toward town in the wagon, the spring sun warming their backs. Eliza had changed into a nicer dress for the occasion, a moss green affair that matched her eyes. Harrison had made an effort too, changing his shirt and even trimming his beard slightly. He wasn't sure why he bothered, but something about riding into town with Eliza made him conscious of his appearance in a way he hadn't been in years. Redemption Creek was indeed a small town, but it was growing. The railroad had come through the valley 2 years ago, bringing with it new settlers and businesses. The main street boasted a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, the church, and of course, Henry's saloon, the Lucky Draw. There was also a doctor's office, though old Doc Simmons was more often drunk than sober, and a newly established bank that most of the locals viewed with suspicion. Harrison helped Eliza down from the wagon in front of the general store. I need to speak with Henry. You want to look around the store while I do that? Actually, I'd like to meet your friend if that's all right, the man who convinced you to write to me. Harrison hesitated, then nodded. The Lucky Draw wasn't exactly a proper establishment for a lady, but this was the frontier. Rules were different here. The saloon was quiet this early in the afternoon. A couple of ranch hands nursed beers at a corner table, and an old-timer dozed by the pot-bellied stove. Behind the bar stood Henry Blackstone, tall and broad-shouldered, with a shock of sandy hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. His left sleeve was pinned empty at the shoulder, a permanent reminder of Gettysburg. Henry looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of Eliza. Well, I'll be damned, he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. Harrison Zane, you actually went and did it. Henry, Harrison greeted him. This is my wife, Eliza. Eliza, this is Henry Blackstone, the best friend a man could ask for, though I'd never tell him that sober. Henry came around the bar, extending his right hand to Eliza. Mrs. Zane, it's a pleasure. I was beginning to think this old coot would die alone with nothing but his whiskey bottle for company. Eliza shook his hand firmly. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blackstone. I understand I have you to thank for my husband's letter. Call me Henry, please, and yes, I may have had a hand in that, though I never expected him to follow through. Harrison here isn't exactly known for his follow-through these days. Harrison scowled. That's enough, Henry. You'll give my wife the wrong impression. Henry laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the room. Too late for that, I reckon. Come on, let me pour you both a drink. On the house, to celebrate. Harrison glanced at Eliza, expecting her to decline, but she surprised him by nodding. A small one, perhaps, to toast the occasion. They settled at a table near the window, and Henry brought over a bottle of his good whiskey, the kind he usually kept hidden under the bar. So, Mrs. Zane, tell me about yourself. What possessed a lovely woman like you to answer an advertisement from a crusty old cowboy like Harrison? I'm not that old, Harrison protested. Eliza smiled, accepting the small glass of amber liquid. I was looking for a change. The war took my father and my mother passed last winter. There wasn't much left for me in Missouri. I'm sorry to hear that, Henry said, his tone genuinely sympathetic. Loss seems to be the one thing we all have in common out here. Indeed, Eliza agreed, but I prefer to look forward rather than back. Harrison's letter spoke of building something, of making a life in this beautiful country. That appealed to me. Harrison stared at her, trying to recall what he'd written in that drunken letter. Had he really been so eloquent? It seemed unlikely. Well, you couldn't have picked a better man, Henry said, raising his glass. For all his faults, and Lord knows he has plenty, Harrison Zane is the most loyal, hard-working, honest man I've ever known, when he's not pickling his liver, that is. To new beginnings, Eliza said, lifting her glass. To new beginnings, Harrison and Henry echoed. As the afternoon wore on, Harrison found himself watching the easy camaraderie that developed between his wife and his best friend. They chatted like old acquaintances, with Henry regaling Eliza with stories of their youth, some of which made Harrison cringe with embarrassment. But Eliza laughed in all the right places, her eyes sparkling with genuine amusement. It was strange, Harrison thought, how quickly his life had changed. 2 days ago, he'd been a solitary, bitter man drowning his sorrows in cheap whiskey. Now he was a husband, watching his wife charm his best friend, feeling something like contentment for the first time in years. Later, as they rode back to the ranch with the wagon loaded with supplies, Eliza broke the comfortable silence. "I like your friend. He cares for you a great deal." "Henry's a good man," Harrison agreed. "Saved my life more than once during the war, and after when I came back, broken." The admission cost him, but something about Eliza made it easier to speak of these things. "We're all broken in some way," she said softly. "It's what we do with the pieces that matters." Harrison glanced at her, wondering again what wounds she carried. "What about you, Eliza? What broke you?" She was quiet for so long that Harrison thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if recalling events from another lifetime. "I was engaged once, before the war. He was killed at Shiloh. After that, I helped my father with the ranch. Then the raiders came, bushwhackers, they called themselves. They burned everything, killed my father while I hid in the root cellar. My mother and I survived, but she was never the same. Her heart gave out this past winter." "I'm sorry," Harrison said, inadequate words for such loss. "That's a heavy burden for anyone to bear." "No heavier than yours, I suspect," Eliza replied. "We all have our ghosts, Harrison. I've made my peace with mine." "Have you?" The question hung between them as the wagon rattled over the rutted trail. Harrison couldn't bring himself to answer. How could he explain that his ghosts walked with him daily, that sometimes he woke screaming from dreams of blood and smoke and death? That the only peace he'd found was at the bottom of a bottle, but Eliza seemed to understand his silence. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, a gesture of comfort that required no words. And for the moment, that was enough. The days fell into a rhythm as April turned to May. Harrison found himself rising earlier, staying sober, working the ranch with a dedication he hadn't shown in years. Eliza proved to be a capable partner, taking over the household tasks, but also helping with the cattle when needed. She could ride as well as any man, and her knowledge of ranching, though different from the ways of Wyoming territory, was solid. They still slept apart, Harrison in the barn, Eliza in the cabin, but their days were spent in increasingly comfortable companionship. They talked more freely now, sharing stories of their lives before they'd met. Harrison found himself laughing again, something he'd almost forgotten how to do. Every few days they would ride into town, sometimes for supplies, sometimes just to visit with Henry at the Lucky Draw. The three of them would sit for hours, talking and laughing, and Harrison began to notice how Henry's eyes followed Eliza when she moved, how his friend's face lit up whenever she entered the room. It should have bothered him, perhaps, but strangely, it didn't. There was something right about seeing the two people he cared about most getting along so well. Besides, Harrison told himself, his marriage to Eliza was one of convenience, not passion. They were partners, maybe friends, but nothing more. At least, that's what he told himself until the night of the storm. It came rolling in from the mountains without warning, a violent spring tempest that turned the afternoon sky an ominous green. Harrison and Eliza had been mending fences on the north pasture when the first fat droplets began to fall. "We need to get back," Harrison shouted over the rising wind. "These Wyoming storms can turn deadly fast." They mounted their horses, but before they'd gone half a mile, the skies opened. Rain fell in blinding sheets, and lightning split the darkened heavens. Thunder boomed so loudly that Harrison's gelding reared in fright. "This way," he called to Eliza, leading them toward an old line shack his father had built years ago. It wasn't much, just a one-room shelter for hands caught out in bad weather, but it would be safer than trying to make it back to the main house. They reached the shack just as hail began to fall. pellets of ice the size of robin's eggs hammering the roof with a deafening rattle. Inside, it was dark and musty, but dry. Harrison lit a lantern that hung from a ceiling beam, its warm glow revealing a Spartan interior, a small iron stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. "We'll wait it out here," he said, moving to the stove to check if there was any dry wood. There wasn't much, but enough for a small fire. "Should pass in an hour or so." Eliza nodded, wringing water from her sodden dress. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet tendrils around her face. Despite her bedraggled appearance, or perhaps because of it, Harrison thought she'd never looked more beautiful. The realization struck him with the force of the lightning outside. When had he started thinking of Eliza as beautiful? When had his feelings shifted from polite appreciation to something more urgent, more primal? "You're staring," Eliza said, a faint smile curving her lips. Harrison looked away quickly, busying himself with the fire. "Sorry, just. You remind me of a painting my mother had, woman caught in a storm, looking wild and free." "Is that how you see me, Harrison, wild and free?" He risked a glance at her. "Sometimes, when you're riding or working with the cattle, there's a lightness to you then, like you've shed something heavy." Eliza moved closer, drawn by the warmth of the small fire he'd managed to coax to life. "And how do you see yourself?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't much think about it," he said finally. "Just trying to get through each day, I reckon. And is that enough? Just getting through?" Harrison stared into the flames. "Used to be, before you came." The admission hung in the air between them, as tangible as the steam rising from their damp clothes. Outside, the storm continued its furious assault, but within the shack, a different kind of tension was building. "And now?" Eliza asked softly. Harrison looked up, meeting her gaze. "Now I'm not sure. Everything's different." Eliza took a step closer. "Different how?" "I find myself thinking about tomorrow and the day after, making plans, hoping for things." Harrison swallowed hard. "It's been a long time since I hoped for anything." "What do you hope for, Harrison?" He stood, closing the distance between them. "This," he said, and kissed her. It was tentative at first, a question more than a demand. But when Eliza's arms slid around his neck, when she pressed herself against him with a small sound of need, the question was answered. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and longing pouring out of both of them. "Eliza," Harrison breathed against her mouth. "I never expected, nor did I," she whispered back. "But here we are." Outside, the storm raged on, but neither of them noticed. The narrow cot proved just wide enough for 2 people who had no desire to be apart. They discovered each other slowly, with wonder and tenderness, their bodies speaking what words could not fully express. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath Harrison's coat, the storm finally began to abate. Rain still pattered on the roof, but the thunder had moved on, rumbling distantly now. "What happens now?" Eliza asked, her head pillowed on his chest. Harrison stroked her hair, still damp from the rain. "I reckon we start behaving like a proper married couple, if that's what you want." She lifted her head to look at him. "Is it what you want, Harrison?" He considered the question. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a broken man with no future. Now he had Eliza, and with her, the possibility of something he'd thought forever lost to him, happiness. "Yes," he said simply, "it's what I want." Eliza smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "Then that's what we'll do." The storm had cleansed the world, leaving everything fresh and new. As they rode back to the ranch, side by side in the gathering dusk, Harrison felt as if he too had been washed clean. The ghosts still walked with him, but their voices were quieter now, their grip less tight. That night, for the first time, Harrison slept in his own bed, with Eliza curled against him. And for the first time in years, he didn't dream of war. June brought long, golden days and the promise of a good calving season. The ranch was coming back to life under their combined efforts. Harrison had hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload, young brothers named Joe and Tom Miller, sons of a neighboring rancher who were eager to earn their own stake. Eliza had transformed the cabin, adding touches that made it feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep. She'd planted a garden, coaxing vegetables from the rich Wyoming soil. She'd hung curtains at the windows and spread a colorful quilt on their bed. Small things, but they spoke of permanence, of putting down roots. Their trips to town became social occasions. Eliza had made friends among the women of Redemption Creek, particularly Sarah Williams, the parson's wife, and Mary Chen, who ran the town's small restaurant with her husband. The three women could often be found chatting on the porch of the general store while their husbands conducted business. And always, there was Henry. The bond between him and Harrison seemed to strengthen with each passing day. Henry was a frequent visitor to the ranch, bringing news from town or simply coming by to share a meal. He and Eliza had developed a teasing rapport that Harrison enjoyed watching. It was as if his two worlds, the lonely, broken past and the hopeful present, had merged seamlessly. "You're a lucky man, Harrison Zane," Henry said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. Eliza was inside, preparing supper, the sounds of her movements and occasional snatches of song drifting through the open window. "Don't I know it?" Harrison agreed, taking a sip of coffee. "Never thought I'd have this again. A home. A future. She's good for you," Henry said. "Brought you back from the edge," Harrison nodded. "She did at that, though you helped pushing me to write that advertisement," Henry laughed. "Best drunken decision you ever made. You know, I still don't remember writing it or sending it." "That's because you didn't send it," Henry said. "You wrote it, all right, rambling mess of a thing, but you crumpled it up and tossed it on the floor before passing out. I'm the one who mailed it." Harrison stared at his friend. "You sent it, without telling me, figured what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you," Henry shrugged. "And I was right, wasn't I? Look at you now, sober, happy, ranch coming back to life. I'd say my interference worked out just fine." Harrison couldn't argue with the results, though the revelation was surprising. "Well, I owe you one then, the biggest one yet." Henry's expression turned serious. "You don't owe me anything, Harry, after what you did at Gettysburg, saving my sorry hide after I lost this." He gestured to his missing arm. "I'm the one who'll always be in your debt." Harrison shook his head. "That's not how friendship works, Henry. We don't keep score." "No, I suppose we don't," Henry agreed. "Still, seeing you happy, it's all the repayment I need." Eliza called them in to supper then, and the moment passed. But later that night, as he lay beside his sleeping wife, Harrison found himself thinking about how a single act, Henry mailing that letter without his knowledge, had changed the entire course of his life. It was a sobering thought, how thin the line between despair and happiness could be. How easily he might have continued his downward spiral if not for Henry's interference. How close he'd come to missing this chance at redemption. Harrison pulled Eliza closer, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. Whatever twist of fate had brought her to him, he was grateful for it beyond words. July brought scorching heat, and the cattle roundup. Harrison, Eliza, the Miller boys, and 3 additional hired hands spent long days in the saddle, gathering the herd for counting and branding. It was exhausting work, but satisfying in a bone-deep way that Harrison had almost forgotten. Eliza proved her worth a dozen times over, riding as hard as any man and showing a natural skill with the calves that even the most skeptical of the hands had to acknowledge. By the end of the roundup, she'd earned the respect of every man on the crew. "Your missus is something else," Joe Miller said one evening as they sat around the campfire. "Never seen a woman take to ranching like she has." "She grew up on a cattle ranch in Missouri," Harrison explained, pride evident in his voice. "Knows more about breeding stock than I do, truth be told." "Lucky man," Tom Miller added, tipping his hat in Eliza's direction where she sat mending a torn shirt by the light of the fire. "That I am," Harrison agreed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The final tally showed 67 head, a modest increase from the previous year, but a promising sign nonetheless. Harrison paid the hired hands their wages and sent them on their way with his thanks. The Miller boys would stay on, helping with the day-to-day operations of the ranch. "We should celebrate," Eliza suggested as they rode back to the cabin. "A successful roundup deserves recognition. Why don't we have Henry out for supper tomorrow? I'll make that venison stew he likes so much." Harrison smiled at her enthusiasm. "That sounds like a fine idea. I'll ride into town in the morning and invite him." The next day dawned clear and hot, the sky a vast blue bowl overhead. Harrison set out for Redemption Creek early, wanting to return before the worst heat of the day. Eliza had given him a list of supplies to pick up while he was in town: flour, sugar, coffee, and a few yards of blue gingham she'd had her eye on for new curtains. The town was quiet when he arrived, most people seeking shelter from the relentless sun. Harrison tied his horse at the hitching post outside the Lucky Draw and pushed through the batwing doors, expecting to find Henry behind the bar as usual. Instead, he found the saloon empty except for the bartender, a young man named Peter who helped out when Henry was busy elsewhere. "Morning, Mr. Zane," Peter greeted him. "Hot one today." "That it is," Harrison agreed. "Henry around?" Peter shook his head. "Haven't seen him since yesterday afternoon, figured he might be out at your place." Harrison frowned. It wasn't like Henry to leave the saloon unattended without telling someone where he was going. He say anything before he left, where he was headed? "No, sir, just closed up early and rode out, seemed in a hurry now that I think on it." A tendril of unease curled in Harrison's gut. "I'll check with Doc Simmons, see if Henry's feeling poorly." But Doc Simmons hadn't seen Henry either. Neither had anyone else Harrison asked around town. It was as if his friend had simply vanished. With growing concern, Harrison completed his errands quickly and headed back to the ranch. Maybe Henry had indeed gone there, planning to surprise them. It would be just like him to show up unannounced, especially if he'd heard about the successful roundup. But when Harrison arrived home, there was no sign of Henry. Eliza was in the garden, her straw hat shielding her face from the sun as she pulled weeds from between rows of corn. "Did Henry stop by?" Harrison asked, dismounting. Eliza looked up, surprise evident on her face. "No, wasn't he in town?" Harrison shook his head, the unease now blossoming into genuine worry. "No one's seen him since yesterday afternoon. It's not like him to just disappear without telling anyone." Eliza stood, dusting soil from her hands. Perhaps he had business elsewhere, in Cheyenne or Laramie. "Maybe," Harrison conceded, though it didn't sound right. Henry always told him when he was leaving town. "I'll check his cabin. He lives just outside town on the other side." "I'll come with you," Eliza said immediately. "Let me change quickly." 20 minutes later, they were riding hard toward Henry's small homestead. It was a modest place, just a one-room cabin and a small stable for his horse. Henry had never been much interested in ranching or farming, preferring the social aspects of running the saloon. As they approached, Harrison noticed with relief that smoke was rising from the cabin's chimney. "He's home," he said to Eliza, spurring his horse forward. They dismounted in front of the cabin and Harrison called out, "Henry, it's Harrison and Eliza." There was no answer. Harrison exchanged a worried glance with Eliza, then moved to the door. "Henry, you in there?" Still no response. Harrison tried the door and found it unlocked. Pushing it open, he stepped inside, Eliza close behind him. The cabin was empty, but the stove was lit, a pot of coffee simmering on its surface. A half-eaten breakfast sat on the table, as if abandoned mid-meal. Henry's saddle bags were open on the bed, clothes spilling out as if he'd been packing in a hurry. "Something's not right," Harrison muttered, looking around for any clue to his friend's whereabouts. Henry wouldn't just leave like this. Eliza moved to the table, examining the abandoned meal. "The coffee's still hot. He can't have been gone long." Harrison was about to suggest they check the stable when he noticed a piece of paper tucked under a coffee cup. He pulled it out and unfolded it, recognizing Henry's distinctive scrawl. "It's a note," he said. "Had to leave town in a hurry. Don't look for me. I'm sorry for everything. Henry." "What does that mean?" Eliza asked, reading over his shoulder. "Sorry for everything," Harrison shook his head, bewildered. "I don't know. It doesn't make any sense." They searched the rest of the cabin but found nothing to explain Henry's cryptic note or sudden departure. His horse was gone from the stable, along with his rifle and saddlebags. "We should tell the sheriff," Eliza suggested as they mounted up to return to town. "Maybe there's more to this than we know." Sheriff Miller, father to Joe and Tom, listened gravely to their story. "Can't say I'm surprised," he said when Harrison finished. "Had some strangers in town yesterday asking about Henry, rough-looking types, said they were old friends from back east, but I didn't like the look of them." "What did they want?" Harrison demanded. "Didn't say exactly." Just asked where they could find him. I pointed them toward the lucky draw. The sheriff scratched his beard thoughtfully. You think Henry's in some kind of trouble? I don't know, Harrison admitted, but I aim to find out. They spent the rest of the day asking around town, trying to piece together Henry's movements and those of the strangers. By nightfall, they had a clearer picture, and it wasn't a comforting one. The strangers' 3 men in expensive Eastern suits had arrived on the afternoon stage. They'd gone straight to the lucky draw, where they'd spoken with Henry for about an hour. According to Peter, the conversation had been tense, with one of the men showing Henry what looked like official papers. Shortly afterward, Henry had closed the saloon and disappeared. Bounty hunters, maybe. Sheriff Miller suggested, or Pinkertons. For what? Harrison demanded. Henry's never been in trouble with the law. He fought for the Union, for God's sake. People have secrets, Harrison, Eliza said gently, even those closest to us. Harrison couldn't accept it, not Henry. They'd been through too much together, shared too many confidences. If Henry had secrets, Harrison would have known, wouldn't he? They returned to the ranch that night, both lost in their own thoughts. Eliza prepared a simple supper, but neither had much appetite. The celebration they'd planned seemed hollow now, overshadowed by Henry's mysterious departure. What do we do now? Eliza asked as they sat on the porch, watching darkness settle over the land. Harrison sighed, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. We wait. And hope Henry comes back with an explanation that makes sense of all this. And if he doesn't, then I go looking for him, Harrison said firmly. I owe him that much. Eliza reached for his hand, her fingers twining with his. We owe him that much, she corrected. Whatever happens, we face it together. Harrison squeezed her hand gratefully. In just a few short months, Eliza had become his partner in every sense of the word. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he took comfort in knowing she would be by his side. Days passed with no word from Henry. Harrison divided his time between working the ranch and riding into town to check for any news. The strangers had departed on the eastbound stage the same day they'd arrived, according to the station master. No one knew where Henry had gone, though rumors abounded everything from gambling debts to a secret family back east. Harrison dismissed most of these as idle gossip, but the lack of concrete information gnawed at him. He found himself replaying conversations with Henry, searching for clues he might have missed. What secrets could his friend have been harboring all these years? A week after Henry's disappearance, Harrison was mucking out stalls in the barn when he heard the sound of an approaching horse. Hope surged through him. Maybe it was Henry, returned to explain everything. But when he stepped outside, he saw not Henry but a young boy from town, riding hard toward the ranch. The boy, Jimmy Porter, was the son of the telegraph operator. Mr. Zane, Jimmy called, reining his horse to a stop. Pa sent me to fetch you. There's a telegram come for you from Cheyenne, says it's urgent. Harrison's heart quickened. From Henry, Jimmy shook his head. Don't know, sir. Pa just said to get you quick. Tell your pa I'm coming, Harrison said, already turning toward the house to get Eliza. They rode into town together, anxiety building with each mile. At the telegraph office, Mr. Porter handed Harrison a yellow slip of paper. Came in an hour ago, he explained. From the marshal's office in Cheyenne. Harrison unfolded the telegram, Eliza reading over his shoulder. Harrison Zane, stop Henry Blackstone, gravely injured, stop. Asking for you, stop, come. Immediately stop Territorial Hospital, Cheyenne, stop Marshal James Doyle. Oh my God, Eliza breathed. What happened to him? Harrison was already moving toward the door. I don't know, but I aim to find out. The afternoon stage to Cheyenne leaves in an hour. I need to be on it. We need to be on it, Eliza corrected. I'm coming with you. Harrison wanted to argue the ranch couldn't run itself, but one look at Eliza's determined face told him it would be futile. Besides, he was grateful for her support. The thought of facing whatever awaited in Cheyenne alone was daunting. All right, he conceded. Let's go home and pack quickly. I'll talk to Joe Miller about watching the place while we're gone. 3 hours later, they were on the stage to Cheyenne, bouncing uncomfortably on hard leather seats as the coach rattled along the rutted road. It was a 9-hour journey in good weather, longer if they encountered problems. Every minute felt like an eternity to Harrison, who could think of nothing but Henry lying injured in a hospital bed. He'll be all right, Eliza said, squeezing his hand as if reading his thoughts. Henry's strong. Harrison nodded, trying to believe it. I just don't understand what he was doing in Cheyenne, or who would want to hurt him. We'll have answers soon, Eliza promised. Try to rest. There's nothing we can do until we reach Cheyenne, but rest was impossible. Harrison spent the journey staring out the window at the passing landscape, his mind racing with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. They reached Cheyenne just after midnight, the town quiet except for the saloons and gambling houses that lined the main street. Despite the late hour, Harrison insisted on going directly to the hospital. Eliza, though clearly exhausted, didn't argue. The Territorial Hospital was a 3-story brick building on the outskirts of town. A sleepy-eyed nurse directed them to the 3rd floor where the most serious cases were treated. Room 307, she said, but visiting hours are over. You'll have to come back in the morning. I'm not leaving until I see him, Harrison said firmly. The marshal himself summoned us. Henry Blackstone is my closest friend. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but be quiet. Other patients are sleeping. They climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, their footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. Room 307 was at the far end, a shaft of light spilling from beneath the closed door. Harrison took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find, then knocked softly. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Marshal Doyle, Harrison asked. The man nodded. You must be Zane, and Mrs. Zane didn't expect both of you. How is he? Harrison asked, trying to see past the marshal into the room. Marshal Doyle's expression was grim. Alive, but just barely. Doctor says the next 24 hours are critical. He's been asking for you, though. Keeps saying he needs to explain. Explain what? I was hoping you might know, the marshal said, stepping aside to let them enter. He's not been very coherent. The room was small, with a single bed, a chair, and a small table. On the bed lay Henry, his face ashen against the white pillows, his breathing shallow and labored. Bandages covered his chest, stained with seeping blood. Henry, Harrison breathed, moving quickly to his friend's side. What happened to you? Henry's eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly. Harry, that really you? It's me. And Eliza, we came as soon as we got word. Harrison took his friend's hand, alarmed at how cold it felt. Who did this to you? Henry's gaze drifted to Eliza, who stood at the foot of the bed, her face a mask of concern. Eliza, he whispered. I'm sorry, so sorry. For what, Henry? She asked, moving closer. You have nothing to be sorry for. Henry coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent fresh blood seeping through his bandages. I lied, he gasped. To both of you. Marshal Doyle stepped forward. Maybe I should explain, he said. Mr. Blackstone was shot 3 times by a man named William Vaughn. Claims Blackstone seduced his wife and ruined his family. Harrison felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. Vaughn, he repeated, looking from the marshal to Eliza, whose face had gone as pale as Henry's. As in, Elizabeth Vaughn, Henry confirmed weakly. Your wife. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Harrison gripped the edge of the bed to steady himself. I don't understand, he said, though a terrible understanding was beginning to dawn. Henry closed his eyes, pain etching deep lines around his mouth. The advertisement, he said. I didn't just mail it. I wrote it, sent it to Eliza specifically. We'd been corresponding for months. What are you saying? Harrison demanded, though he feared he already knew. I'm saying I knew Eliza before she came to Redemption Creek. Met her in St. Louis 2 years ago when I was there on business. We fell in love. Henry's gaze shifted to Eliza, who stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth. But I couldn't offer her a proper life, not with this. He gestured to his missing arm. Not with the nightmares and the drinking, so I told her about you, how you were a good man despite your troubles. How you deserved happiness. You arranged our marriage. Harrison felt as if he'd been kicked in the chest by a mule. Without telling me, without telling her, I meant to tell you both, Henry said, his voice growing weaker. After you'd had a chance to know each other. To see if you could be happy together, and you were. I could see it every time I visited. The way you looked at each other, the way the ranch was coming back to life. Harrison turned to Eliza, who hadn't moved or spoken. Did you know? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you know who I was when you answered that advertisement? Eliza nodded, tears streaming down her face. Henry had told me about you, his best friend who'd saved his life, who deserved a second chance at happiness. But I didn't know. I didn't know he was the one who wrote to me. He signed your name. Harrison felt as if he were drowning, struggling to make sense of these revelations. So our entire marriage is based on a lie, a manipulation. No, Henry coughed, blood flecking his lips. Not a lie, a hope, that two people I care about could heal each other. Could find what I couldn't give either of you. And William Vaughn? Harrison asked, turning back to the marshal. Who is he to Eliza, her husband? Marshal Doyle said. Or so he claims. Says they were married in Missouri 5 years ago before he went off to seek his fortune in California. Returned to find his wife gone and traced her here through Mr. Blackstone. Harrison stared at Eliza in disbelief. You're already married, Eliza shook her head vehemently. No, William and I were engaged, yes, but he never returned from California. I received word he died in a mining accident. I mourned him, Harrison. For 2 years I mourned him. She's telling the truth, Henry gasped. Vaughn abandoned her, left her with nothing but promises. He has no claim on her now. Marshal Doyle cleared his throat awkwardly. Be that as it may, Mr. Vaughn is in custody for the shooting, but he's demanding to see Mrs. Zane. Says he can prove they're legally married. Harrison felt as if he were trapped in some bizarre nightmare. Everything he thought he knew about his marriage, about Henry, about Eliza was crumbling around him. I need some air, he said abruptly, turning toward the door. Harrison, please, Eliza called after him. Let me explain, but Harrison couldn't listen, not now. Not with the roaring in his ears and the taste of betrayal bitter on his tongue. He pushed past the marshal and out into the corridor, his boots echoing on the wooden floor as he fled. Outside, the night air was cool against his flushed face. Harrison leaned against the hospital wall, drawing deep breaths, trying to steady himself. His mind was a chaos of conflicting emotions, anger, hurt, confusion. How could Henry have done this? How could Eliza have gone along with it? And yet, despite the deception, the past few months had been the happiest of Harrison's life. His feelings for Eliza were real, regardless of how they'd come together. The home they'd built, the future they'd begun to plan, all of it had been genuine, at least on his part. But what about on hers? Had she been thinking of Henry all along, settling for second best because her true love couldn't or wouldn't marry her? The door opened behind him and Harrison tensed, expecting Eliza. Instead, it was Marshal Doyle. Thought you might want this, he said, offering a silver flask. Not usually one to encourage drinking, but sometimes a man needs fortification. Harrison accepted the flask gratefully, taking a long swallow of the fiery whiskey. Thank you, Doyle nodded, leaning against the wall beside him. For what it's worth, I don't think either of them meant to hurt you. Blackstone's been talking in his sleep, delirious with fever. Keeps saying he wanted to give you both a chance at happiness. By lying to us, by manipulating our lives, people do strange things for love, the marshal said simply. Sometimes they even convince themselves that deception is kindness. Harrison took another drink, the alcohol burning a path to his stomach. And Vaughn, what's his story? Claims he went to California to make his fortune, struck gold, came back to claim his bride only to find her gone. Tracked her through letters she'd written to Blackstone. Says they were married by a circuit preacher just before he left for California. And was that true? Were they married? Doyle shrugged. No way to know for sure. Circuit preachers don't always keep the best records. But I will say this: Vaughn doesn't strike me as an honest man, too quick with his gun, too ready to shoot rather than talk. Harrison handed the flask back to the marshal. I need to speak with him, with Vaughn. That might not be wise, Doyle cautioned. He's in no mood to be reasonable. Nevertheless, I need to hear what he has to say, to judge for myself whether he's telling the truth. The marshal studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, he's at the jail. I can take you there now if you'd like. Harrison glanced back at the hospital entrance. What about Eliza? And Henry? Mrs. Zane is with Blackstone. Doctors with them too. Nothing more to be done tonight except wait and pray. Doyle pushed away from the wall. Come on, let's go have a chat with Mr. Vaughn. The Cheyenne jail was a squat brick building a few blocks from the hospital. Inside, a single deputy dozed at a desk, jerking awake as they entered. Evening, Marshal, he said, straightening his rumpled uniform. Didn't expect you back tonight. Need to speak with Vaughn, Doyle replied. This is Mr. Zane, husband to the woman Vaughn claims is his wife. The deputy's eyebrows shot up. That's so. Well, he's in the last cell, been quiet at least. They moved past the desk to a row of cells along the back wall. In the last one, a man sat on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. He looked up as they approached, and Harrison got his first look at William Vaughn. He was younger than Harrison had expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were expensive but travel-worn. There was a hardness to his face that spoke of difficult years, but his eyes were clear and intelligent. Mr. Vaughn, Marshal Doyle said. This is Harrison Zane. He'd like to speak with you about Mrs. Vaughn, or Mrs. Zane as she's known here. Vaughn stood, approaching the bars. So you're the man Eliza's been living with, he said, his voice carrying a hint of the South. The one Blackstone arranged for her to marry. I'm her husband, yes, Harrison replied, meeting the man's gaze steadily, though I'm beginning to wonder if either of us knew what we were getting into. Vaughn laughed, a bitter sound. She has a talent for that, doesn't she? Making men believe what she wants them to believe. I should know. I spent 5 years believing she'd wait for me. You left her, Harrison said. She thought you were dead. Is that what she told you? Vaughn shook his head. I wrote to her every month for the first year. When the letters stopped coming back, I assumed she'd moved on. It wasn't until I returned to Missouri that I learned she'd left the state entirely. Took me another year to track her to St. Louis, where I heard about her. Association with Blackstone. Harrison frowned. You're saying she received your letters, that she knew you were alive? Ask her yourself, Vaughn replied. Ask her about the last letter I sent, telling her I'd struck gold and was coming home. Ask her why she ran. Harrison felt sick. Could Eliza have lied about something so fundamental? Could she have known William was alive all along? You claim you were married, he said, changing tack. Do you have proof? Vaughn reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Marriage certificate. Signed by Reverend James Hollies, April 12, 1870. We were married 2 days before I left for California. Harrison took the document, scanning it quickly. It looked official enough, though as Marshal Doyle had said, circuit preachers weren't always the most reliable record keepers. This could be forged, he said, handing it back. Vaughn's expression hardened. I have witnesses, people back in Missouri who attended the ceremony, and I have letters from Eliza addressing me as her husband. Would I have tracked her across half the country if I didn't have a legitimate claim? It was a fair point, but something still didn't add up. If what you say is true, why did Eliza believe you were dead? Why would she think that if she'd been receiving your letters? For the first time, Vaughn looked uncomfortable. I can't speak to what she believed or didn't believe. I only know that I wrote to her, and eventually my letters started coming back marked addressee unknown. When I returned to Missouri, her mother told me Eliza had gone to St. Louis to make a new life. Said she'd been mourning me for years. So you never actually confirmed she received your letters? Vaughn hesitated. No, but why wouldn't she? We were in love, we were married. She promised to wait for me. Harrison turned to Marshal Doyle. I've heard enough, I need to speak with my wife. The marshal nodded. I'll accompany you back to the hospital. As they turned to leave, Vaughn called after them. Ask her about the baby, Zane. Ask her what happened to our child. Harrison froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. What baby? Vaughn's smile was cruel. She was with child when I left. Our firstborn. Ask her where that child is now. Harrison lunged toward the cell, his hands gripping the bars. You're lying, am I? Vaughn asked softly. Ask her yourself, see if she denies it. It took both Marshal Doyle and the deputy to pull Harrison away from the cell. Outside, in the cool night air, Harrison bent over, hands on his knees, fighting the urge to be sick. He could be lying, Doyle said, placing a steadying hand on Harrison's shoulder. Men like that, they'll say anything to hurt those they think have wronged them. Harrison straightened, his face grim. There's only one way to know for sure. I need to speak with Eliza. They walked back to the hospital in silence, Harrison's mind racing with questions, each more painful than the last. Had Eliza been married to Vaughn? Had she been carrying his child? And if so, what had happened to that child? By the time they reached the hospital, dawn was breaking, pale light seeping into the eastern sky. The same nurse who had admitted them hours before was still at her desk, looking tired but alert. "How is Mr. Blackstone?" Harrison asked as they passed. The nurse's expression was solemn, "Still with us but weakening. The doctor doesn't think he'll last the day." Harrison's heart sank. Despite everything, the lies, the manipulation, he couldn't bear the thought of losing Henry. They had too much history, too many shared battles and scars. "And my wife, is she still with him?" "Yes, sir. Hasn't left his side all night." Harrison nodded his thanks and continued up the stairs, Marshal Doyle following at a discreet distance. Outside room 307, he paused, steeling himself for whatever truths awaited on the other side of that door. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly, then entered without waiting for a response. The scene that greeted him was both familiar and strange. Henry lay as before, pale and still, his breathing now so shallow it was barely perceptible. Beside him, Eliza sat in the straight-backed chair, her hand resting on Henry's, her head bowed in what might have been prayer. She looked up as Harrison entered, her face tear-streaked, her eyes red, rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "He's dying," she said simply. Harrison moved to the other side of the bed, gazing down at his oldest friend. "I know." Henry's eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly. "Harry," he whispered, "you came back." "Of course I came back, you stubborn fool," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "Someone has to talk sense into you." A ghost of a smile touched Henry's lips. "Too late for that." "I've spoken with Vaughn," Harrison said, his gaze shifting to Eliza. "He claims you were married, that you knew he was alive all along, that you were carrying his child when he left for California." Eliza flinched as if struck, her face draining of color. "Harrison, please, is it true?" he demanded. "Were you married to him? Did you know he was alive when you came to Wyoming? Did you lose a child?" Henry's hand tightened on Eliza's. "Let her explain, Harry, it's not what you think." Harrison waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything, his marriage, his future, his understanding of the past few months hung on Eliza's next words. She took a deep breath, then met his gaze directly. "Yes, William and I were married," she said quietly. "It was a small ceremony just before he left for California. He promised to send for me once he'd established himself, and yes, I was with child." Harrison felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "And the baby, I lost it," Eliza said, tears filling her eyes. 3 months after William left, there was a storm and I was trying to secure the livestock. I fell, the baby didn't survive, and Vaughn, you thought he was dead," Eliza nodded. "I wrote to him about the miscarriage but received no reply. After 6 months without word, I began to worry. After a year, I wrote to the mining company he'd said he was working for. They told me William Vaughn had died in a cave-in. But he claims he wrote to you every month for a year, that his letters started coming back marked addressee unknown." "That's impossible," Eliza said, shaking her head. "I never moved. I stayed on my parents' farm until my father was killed. The only letters I ever received from William were in the first 2 months after he left. Then nothing." "Someone's lying," Harrison said, trying to make sense of the conflicting accounts. "Either you or Vaughn." "Or someone intercepted the letters," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible, on both sides. Harrison and Eliza both turned to him. "What do you mean?" Harrison asked. Henry coughed, a weak, rattling sound. "Eliza's mother, she never approved of Vaughn, thought he was beneath her daughter." "What if she intercepted his letters? And Eliza's replies?" Eliza's eyes widened. That's possible. Mother never liked William, said he was a dreamer, that he'd never amount to anything. When I told her I was pregnant, she was furious. Said I'd ruined my life for a man who'd abandoned me." "And after you lost the baby," Harrison prompted, "she became protective, almost obsessively so. Insisted I stay close to home, that I not exert myself. She handled all correspondence, claiming I needed to rest." Eliza's expression changed as the implications sank in. "She could have hidden William's letters, could have told the postmaster to return them. And she could have written to him, pretending to be you, saying you'd moved on," Henry added weakly. The pieces were starting to fit together. Harrison felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, Eliza hadn't been deliberately deceiving him. "But what about St. Louis?" he asked. "Vaughn said he traced you there, that he heard about your association with Henry." Eliza glanced at Henry, a silent communication passing between them. After my father was killed, there was nothing left for me in Missouri, she said. Mother had died the winter before. The farm was in ruins. I went to St. Louis hoping to find work as a teacher. And instead you found Henry, Harrison guessed. Henry nodded weakly. Met her at a charity function. Society ladies raising money for wounded veterans. She was teaching the children of one of the organizers. We became friends, Eliza continued. Henry was kind, attentive. He told me about his life in Wyoming, about his friend who'd saved his life during the war. About how that friend was struggling with his own demons. And you fell in love, Harrison said flatly. Eliza and Henry exchanged another look. It wasn't that simple, she said. We cared for each other, yes, but Henry, he didn't believe he could offer me a proper life. Not with his injury, not with the nightmares that plagued him. So instead he offered you to me, Harrison said bitterly, like some kind of consolation prize. No, Henry gasped, struggling to sit up. Never like that. I wanted both of you to be happy, saw how you fit together. Better than we ever could. He collapsed back against the pillows, his breathing labored, his face gray with exertion and pain. The doctor, who had been standing quietly in the corner, moved forward with concern. He needs to rest, he said firmly. This excitement isn't good for him. I need answers, Harrison insisted. None of this makes sense. If you two cared for each other, why the elaborate deception? Why not simply be together? Eliza's eyes filled with tears. Because Henry was dying, she whispered. He didn't tell me at first, but he'd been coughing blood for months. The doctors in St. Louis gave him a year, maybe two. He didn't want me to tie myself to a dying man. Harrison stared at Henry in shock. Is this true? You're dying, Henry managed a weak nod. Lung disease from the war, all that smoke and gunpowder. Started feeling it about a year ago. Kept getting worse. So you decided to, what, find me a wife before you died, play matchmaker from beyond the grave, wanted to know you'd be taken care of, Henry whispered. Both of you knew you'd look after each other, knew you'd heal each other. The enormity of Henry's deception and the love behind it left Harrison speechless. He sank into the chair on the opposite side of the bed, trying to process everything he'd learned. And the advertisement, he asked finally. The one I supposedly wrote while drunk, I wrote it, Henry admitted. Signed your name, sent it to Eliza, told her it was a sign. That fate wanted her to meet you. And you went along with this, Harrison asked Eliza. Knowing it was based on a lie, she nodded, tears streaming down her face. I was lost, Harrison, alone. Henry convinced me that you needed me as much as I needed someone to need me. He spoke of you with such admiration, such love. I felt as if I already knew you before I ever set foot in Redemption Creek. Harrison ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by the tangle of emotions coursing through him. Anger at the deception, grief for his dying friend, confusion about his feelings for Eliza, which had been real despite their manufactured beginning. And somewhere beneath it all, a grudging admiration for Henry's audacious plan to ensure that the two people he cared about most would be there for each other after he was gone. And Vaughn, he asked, how does he fit into all this? I never expected him to reappear, Eliza said. I truly believed he was dead. When those men came to town asking about Henry, I had no idea they were connected to William. Henry coughed again, blood flecking his lips. Vaughn tracked Eliza to St. Louis, he gasped. Found out about me, about us, followed me to Redemption Creek, been watching. Waiting, for what? Harrison demanded. For a chance to reclaim what he believes is his, Eliza said softly. His wife, his future. The men who came to the lucky draw, Harrison said, understanding dawning. They weren't Pinkertons or bounty hunters, they were Vaughn's men. They showed you papers, proof that Vaughn was alive, that he was coming for Eliza. Henry's voice was fading, his strength clearly waning. I couldn't let him take her, not back to that life, not when she was finally happy with you. Harrison stared at his friend, seeing not the deception but the desperate love behind it. So you ran, tried to lead him away from Redemption Creek, away from us. Henry nodded weakly. Thought if I confronted him, could convince him to leave you both alone, but he was too angry, too hurt. Shot me before I could explain. You fool, Harrison said, his voice breaking. You magnificent, interfering fool. A ghost of a smile touched Henry's lips. Always said, I'd die for you, Harry, just didn't think it would be like this. You're not dying, Harrison insisted, gripping his friend's hand. Not today, not like this. But even as he spoke, he could see the life ebbing from Henry's eyes. The doctor moved forward again, checking Henry's pulse with a grave expression. "Mr. Zane," he said quietly, "I think it's time to say your goodbyes." Harrison felt as if his heart were being torn from his chest. Despite everything, the lies, the manipulation, Henry was still his oldest friend, the man who'd saved his life more times than he could count. "Henry," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "You stubborn, interfering bastard, I never asked you to fix my life." "Didn't do it for you," Henry whispered. "Did it for her, for both of you. You deserve happiness, Harry, more than anyone I know." "And what about what you deserved?" Harrison demanded. "A life, a future, love." Henry's gaze shifted to Eliza, who was openly weeping now. "Had all that," he murmured, "for a little while, enough to know what I was giving up, what I was giving to you both." His breathing was labored now, each inhale a struggle. The doctor shook his head slightly, indicating that the end was near. "Eliza," Henry whispered, "be happy with Harry, promise me." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, Henry, I promise." "Harry," Henry's eyes found his friends, "forgive her, forgive me, love her." "Like I couldn't." Harrison's vision blurred with tears. "I already do, you fool, I already do." A smile touched Henry's lips, peaceful, almost triumphant. His hand tightened briefly on Harrison's, then went slack. A final breath rattled in his chest, and then Henry Blackstone was gone. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Eliza's quiet sobs. Harrison sat frozen, still holding his friend's hand, unable to process that Henry was truly gone. The doctor moved forward, gently closing Henry's eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "He fought hard. Stayed alive long enough to see you both one last time." Harrison nodded mechanically, words beyond him. The grief was a physical presence crushing his chest, making it hard to breathe. Marshall Doyle, who had been standing respectfully in the doorway, stepped into the room. "I'll make the arrangements," he said, "for the body, unless you'd prefer to take him back to Redemption Creek." Harrison looked up, focusing with difficulty. "Yes, he should be buried at home, where his friends can pay their respects." The marshal nodded. "I'll see to it, and Mr. Vaughn. Do you still wish to speak with him?" Harrison glanced at Eliza, who had composed herself somewhat, though tears still tracked down her pale cheeks. "Yes," he said firmly. "There are still questions that need answering." An hour later, after Henry's body had been prepared for transport and Eliza had had a chance to wash her face and compose herself, they returned to the jail. William Vaughn was waiting for them, having been informed of their coming. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said as Eliza entered, his voice carrying both bitterness and longing. "Or do you prefer Mrs. Zane now?" "Her name is Eliza," Harrison said firmly, "and we need to talk, calmly and honestly for once." Vaughn's gaze shifted between them. "I hear Blackstone's dead, can't say I'm sorry. He took what was mine." "I was never yours," Eliza said quietly. "Not in the way you mean, not in the way that matters. We were married," Vaughn insisted. "Before God and witnesses, that makes you mine in every way that counts." Harrison stepped forward. "We know about the letters," he said. "About how Eliza's mother may have intercepted them. About how you believed Eliza had moved on, just as she believed you were dead." Vaughn's expression faltered slightly. "What are you talking about?" "My mother never approved of you," Eliza explained. "After you left, after I lost the baby, she became protective, controlling. She handled all correspondence. If you wrote to me, she could have hidden your letters, could have sent replies in my name telling you I'd moved on." "And the mining company?" Vaughn demanded. "The one that told you I was dead, I wrote to them. But did the reply come directly to me or through my mother? I can't remember now, but it's possible, likely, even that she forged that response as well." Vaughn seemed genuinely shocked by this possibility. "But why? Why would she go to such lengths?" "Because she blamed you for the loss of my baby," Eliza said simply. "Because she thought you'd abandoned me. Because she wanted a different life for me than the one you offered." A heavy silence fell as Vaughn absorbed this information. "So you never received my letters," he said finally. "You truly believed I was dead." "Yes," Eliza confirmed. "Just as you believed I had rejected you, we were both victims of my mother's manipulation." Vaughn's shoulders slumped, the anger seeming to drain out of him. "I spent 5 years believing you'd betrayed me," he said quietly. 5 years working and saving, dreaming of the day I'd confront you, ask you why you'd thrown away what we had. I'm sorry, Eliza said, and she seemed to mean it, for what my mother did. For the years we both lost to her deception. Vaughn looked up, his expression pained. And now, where does this leave us? I'm still your husband in the eyes of the law. That marriage certificate is valid, regardless of the circumstances that followed. Harrison stepped forward. That may be true legally, he acknowledged. But much has changed in 5 years. Eliza has built a new life with me. A life based on another deception, Vaughn pointed out. Blackstone's manipulation. Perhaps, Harrison conceded, but the feelings are real. What we've built together is real. Can you say the same for what remains between you and Eliza? After 5 years and so much bitterness, Vaughn was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted finally. I came here consumed with thoughts of revenge, of reclaiming what was mine, but now, he shook his head. I don't know what I want anymore. I can tell you what I want, Eliza said firmly. I want to return to Redemption Creek, to the life I've built there, with Harrison. She hesitated, then added gently, what we had, William, it belonged to 2 different people in a different time. We've both changed too much to go back. Vaughn's gaze shifted from Eliza to Harrison and back again. You love him, he asked, his voice barely audible. Truly, Eliza glanced at Harrison, her eyes softening. Yes, she said simply, I do. Harrison felt something unfurl in his chest, a warmth that spread through him, dissolving the last of his doubts. Despite the lies and manipulations that had brought them together, what had grown between them was genuine. Henry, in his meddling way, had been right. Vaughn seemed to deflate, all the fight going out of him. I see, he said quietly. Well then, I suppose there's nothing left to say. There is one thing, Harrison said. The charges against you for shooting Henry. Vaughn tensed. He deserved it. He stole my wife. Arranged for her to marry another man. Used deception to, he's dead, Harrison interrupted. Died believing he'd done right by both of us, by you too, in a strange way. He wanted Eliza to be happy and cared for when he couldn't be the one to do it. Can you understand that, even a little? Vaughn was silent, but something in his expression suggested that yes, perhaps he could understand the desperate actions of a man in love. Marshall Doyle is willing to reduce the charges to assault rather than murder, Harrison continued. With a recommendation for leniency given the circumstances, you'd serve some time but not the rest of your life. Why would you do that for me? Vaughn asked, genuinely puzzled. Not for you, Harrison corrected. For Eliza. And for Henry, who, despite everything, wouldn't want his death to destroy another life. Vaughn considered this. And the marriage, what happens to that? Annulment, Eliza said. On the grounds of abandonment and the fact that I believed you dead when I married Harrison. It's cleaner than divorce and more merciful to everyone involved. For a moment, it seemed Vaughn might argue, but then he nodded slowly. All right, he said. I'll accept the reduced charges, and I won't contest the annulment. Relief washed over Harrison. It wasn't a perfect solution, there would still be legal hurdles and whispered gossip, but it was a beginning. A chance to move forward without the shadow of the past hanging over them. Thank you, he said simply. For understanding. Vaughn's smile was bitter. I lost her 5 years ago, he said. I just didn't know it until today. 3 days later, Harrison and Eliza stood beside a freshly dug grave in the small cemetery outside Redemption Creek. Henry's body had been brought home by train, and the entire town had turned out for the funeral. The lucky draw was closed for the day, its windows draped in black crepe. Parson Williams had spoken eloquently of sacrifice and friendship, of a man who had given his life in service to others. He had not mentioned the circumstances of Henry's death or the complex web of deception that had preceded it. Some stories were better left untold. Now, as the last of the mourners drifted away, Harrison and Eliza remained, each lost in their own thoughts. The headstone was simple, just as Henry would have wanted. Henry Blackstone, 1840–1875, friend, soldier, beloved. He would have hated all this fuss, Harrison said finally, breaking the silence. Eliza smiled faintly. Yes, he would have. And then he would have insisted on buying everyone a drink to lighten the mood. That sounds like Henry, Harrison agreed. He looked down at the fresh mound of earth, feeling the weight of all that had happened. I still can't believe he's gone. That he arranged all of this, us knowing he wouldn't be around to see how it turned out. He saw enough, Eliza said softly. He saw that we were happy together, that what he hoped for had come true. Harrison took her hand, twining his fingers with hers. And are we happy? Eliza met his gaze, her eyes clear and certain. Yes, she said simply. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, we are. Harrison nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in his heart. He knew us better than we knew ourselves, he said. Stubborn, interfering fool that he was. He loved us, Eliza replied. Both of us. Enough to give us to each other when he couldn't have what he wanted most. Harrison looked out over the rolling hills of the ranch, visible from the cemetery's slight elevation. The land was greening with spring cattle dotting the distant pastures. A life he had once thought lost to him, now reclaimed. What happens now? He asked, echoing the question Eliza had posed days ago in the storm-battered line shack. She squeezed his hand. Now we live, Harrison. We honor Henry's memory by being happy, by building the life he wanted for us. Harrison nodded, feeling a sense of peace despite the grief that still lingered. Together, he said. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Together, Eliza agreed. They stood a moment longer beside Henry's grave, paying their final respects to the friend who had changed their lives so profoundly. Then, hand in hand, they turned and walked down the hill toward home, toward the future that awaited them. A future that Henry Blackstone, in his wisdom and his folly, his selfishness and his sacrifice, had given them. A gift neither would ever forget, nor ever fully repay except by living it fully, honestly, and with love. The cowboy had indeed married a stranger. And though he had woken to find his best friend's hand in the arrangement, in the end, it had been the most fortunate awakening of his life.